And our wonderful stay in Riga has just started, and well, we still are going to work hard, and it's my pleasure to chair the first of the last session, two sessions today, and the speakers are from three universities. And the main topic of this session is Roman literature and culture and its reception, and particularly Ovid. Two presentations are on this topic. So I would like to invite Viktorija Staišiūnaitė from the Vilnius University. It is the first time for her to speak at the conference, and please listen attentively and ask questions. Okay, Viktorija, I just remind you 20 minutes, we are a bit late.
In my presentation, I will try to highlight the main features of Roman hymns, focusing on those which are important to genre's characteristics. I will invoke mainly the papers of Gladys Martin, Jan Martin Bremer, Michał Svoboda, and Jerzy Danilewicz. For further considerations, primarily it is useful to discuss general peculiarities of prayers and hymns. The ancient hymn developed from a prayer, and the essential elements of the hymn are to be found in the ancient prayers. As we all know, the praying is performed in manner recognizable undoubtedly not only to the prayer, himself, herself, but also to the others, and to particular God too. The prayer hopes to find God's favor, and by praying comes closer to achieving his purpose. The prayer is accompanied by utterances and actions, legomena, kaidromena, characteristic only for this prayer, and is accompanied by utterances and characteristic only for this prayer, only for this kind of practice. The prayer includes regular invocation and petition, and may include to a greater or less degree words of complaint, thanks, of persuasion, and of praise. In the prayer, the petition is naturally the focal point. The hymn is a song in which the longing of the God is ostensibly all important, and the petition takes a second place. It should be noted that there is a considerable overlap between hymns and other forms of utterance in terms of form, content, and function. For this reason, when we wish to part the hymn from the other forms of song, even choral song, we only have to consider the person or entity to whom the composition is addressed. Ancient choral hymns share compositional elements characteristic of prayers. However, formally, a hymn is likely to be a more finished artistic product than a prayer. For example, prayers usually were uttered quickly, more in the manner of normal speech, whilst hymns should be sung or recited in a slow, artistic manner which emphasizes the performance itself. In hymns, the praise and adoration of the God is the major importance than prayer element. Because the hymns were verbal delights to the gods and later to heroes, while the prayer was polite and cautious worshippers' request in return. Prayers and hymns form the verbally articulated complement to rites. They also are communication within the community and with the gods addressed. Now we have to take a glance to Greek world and Greek hymns, which are traced as predecessors of hymns appears in Roman literature. Among Greek hymns we may distinguish the epic and melic hymn, which includes monodic and choral hymns. Many types of Greek choral song, for example, paians, dithyrambs, parthenions, have purpose similar to the hymn. However, in all of them the dance element is more or less prominent, while the hymns were apparently composed for dignified singing at first. Greeks realized that a god is able to receive a prayer even if it is not sung aloud or even uttered at all. Significant phrase found in Herodotus' history, kai ufo neuntos akuo, leads to idea that in ancient world called hymns or prayers could be also acceptable to poets or poets' priests in non-verbal form. because uttered words are not the only way of communication with gods. The poets still developed a rhetoric of prayer from a very early stage in this, widely evidenced in epic and lyric. It is impossible to decide if we have in literature an existing tradition or invented forms, perhaps both of them. The poets should have depicted characters worshipping and praying in an authentic manner. However, they still may have enriched the forms and vocabulary of cult by setting new standards and models of poetic creativity. At the very beginning and later, when Roman religion had come under Greek influence, there are acceptable features of Roman formalism and ceremonialism, which are without any creative force and poetic imagination, which is able to generate the mythology. The Roman formalism is contrary to mythology of Greek hymns. A myth is substance of Greek hymns, and the stories told about the gods in myths were in fact the stories sung to the gods in worship in order to flatter, remind, and praise them. So the myths formed the substance of hymns sung before or during the ritual. Throughout the history of Greek hymnography, there was a creative tension and interaction between the influence and prestige of famous cult centers and the literary tradition cultivated by poets. From the earliest period, poets in Greece tended to be itinerant, moving from place to place to perform at religious festivals or in answer to a commission from wealthy patron. Major cult centers like Delphi, Delos, Athens, Epidaurus, and others led to international character of Greek poetry and poets. Romans addressed their gods in practical and serious way, unrelieved by any light vein of joyous feeling. To placate and propitiate known and unknown gods for Romans was a duty. It was very important to do that in such a way that no one might be offended by or overlooked or by the use of unpropitious word. The essential elements of the hymnodist art were right choices of words, themes, melody, and dance performed by chorus, if there was one. Ancient priests, particularly pre-poets, were guiding people by composing definite formulas, which ought to make their invocations effective. For this reason, prayers and hymns took shape as highly formal and ritualistic utterances, which seem to have been mainly accentual and origin more in accord with the popular speech, it is more natural than the Greek measures later adapted to Latin. The Romans did not develop to any extent the choral lyric as a poetic type, so compared to Greek hymns, we do not have the same complicated variety of forms. At the very beginning, poetry for Romans and for other people was closely linked with religious. Ancient people felt a power which manifested itself in all universe and was worshipped as residing element in all nature, mountains, woods, and valleys. That residing element or spirit should be propitiated with prayers and chants in order to avoid any harm from them. In this case, distinction between magic and religion were not clear at first, because magic tried to work its spell by repetition of fixed formulae, and priest-poet accordingly chanted very often root songs whose efficacy was supposedly heightened by repetition of verses. Now several examples of Roman, just very short prayer hymns, preces, hymns or hymn-like songs. Hymns of the Frater Servales, a primitive cult song which has been handed down to us in the records of the priesthood and which, in the process of oral tradition, had become largely unintelligible even to the priest who sang it. In this hymn, priests are invoking Lares and Mars for help 3 times, and at the end word triumph is repeated 5 times. Carmina Salaria is also very few fragments of this hymn survived. The Romans also had rude Fescennine verses and joyous songs, Carmina Leta, hymns sung by celebrities. They were an essential part of the occasion. It is likely that Carmina Leta were handed down orally. For this reason, they had few chances of surviving. However, ritual hymns of the priest are also represented very scantily, despite the fact that they were used in a cult. At the end of the 3rd century, Livius Andronicus composed a hymn, and a few years later, a similar hymn was composed by Publius Licinius Tegula, and this is mentioned by Livy. Decrevere item pontifices ut virgines ternovene per urbem euntes carmen canerent, it cum in Jovis statoris ede disterent, conditum oblivio poeta Carmen tacta de cielo edis in Aventino Junonis regine. So religious songs, which serve the purposes of the cult, remained simple cult songs handed down from generation to generation, while literary hymns were separated from the service of the cult and were individual creations, written by laymen in imitation of Greek usage. Roman poetry from the 1st century BC came under strong influence of Greek literature. It is not surprising that structure of Roman hymn conforms to the Greek hymn. So there can be distinguished three parts of the hymn. Invocatio, which usually includes names, attributes, epithets, titles, genealogy, places of worship, and companion deities. The second part is praise of the god, laus, often narrated in epic style and having several functions. It narrates, predicts God's powers, reminds his/her earlier benefits or earlier worshipping by prayers, descriptions his/her actions, favorite places. It is characteristic in laudatory part to repeat the pronoun of the second person at intervals in order to continue to hold the intention of the god. The last part contains the petition, preces. The god is addressed with flattering appellations designed to move him to grant the prayer. This final element of the hymn shows the formal connection with prayers as a means of securing divine help, and it is the point of the whole hymn. Preces in the form of cautious expression is preserved from the ritualistic language of prayers and hymns and have their origin in primitive times when men really feared that the prayers might not be effective unless they propitiated the divinity by exactly the right name, and hence they used a general formula that would be all-inclusive. It is also important to remind the god-goddess of past favors so that they may feel obligated to continue them. And as Jerzy Danilevich has noticed in his study Prayer and Hymn in Roman Poetry, that in hymns text works on two different levels of communication. On the one hand, the author, performer of hymn is addressing to the formal addressee, i.e. God, and on the other hand, the real recipient, i.e. the listener or reader. Among the orders of Horace are to be found a number of hymns, carmina, which to be sure fall within the Greek mold and which is the main root the inspiration from the Greek models. Horace's hymn to Apollo and Diana can be comparable to Catullus' hymn to Diana. And there is the structure. The literary hymn in epic verse was also cultivated to some extent by the Romans. Only scattering examples are to be found, and major part of them are works of anonymous and little-known poets. In this paper, I would like to avoid so-called conventional hymns because the belonging to genre of hymns is based mainly on two features. It is the invocation of gods in the prooimia and epic language and form, but formally they belong to or are incorporated in other genres. Nevertheless, notable Latin examples are the Prooimion of Lucretius de Rerum Natura, which contains a hymn to Venus, and Virgil's invocations of Bacchus at the beginning of the second book of the Georgics. Roman emperors were similarly invoked in the Prooimia of the epic poems, even as Virgil includes the future deity Augustus in the opening verses of book first in the Georgics. And as we all know, there are famous hymns, Homeric hymns, and hymns of Callimachus, which were translated, and they really are in attention of researchers. According to the ideas of Greek religion, the Greek hymns depicted the gods as enjoying such things of mortals longing for, particularly as possessing the joy and happiness for which mortals belonged. Literary Greek hymns narrate the adventures of the human-like gods joyfully, whereas Roman hymns, independent or incorporated in longer poems, impress us with the formalism, which fetters poetic imagination or even covers a lack of it. However, it is notable that lyric poems usually do not give much scope for narration. And one more example, Per Vigilium Veneris perhaps is written in 2nd or 3rd century AD. In spirit, it is a hymn in which the poet interweaves a description of the festival with lauding of the goddess. Pervigilium Veneris corresponds to the formal rules for hymn making, although is far removed from hieratic cult songs and literary hymns, showing resemblance to a kind of popular hymn. Refrain is possibly originated in the cult songs of primitive priests, whom people assisted by chanting with them half-magic repetitions, or else in the folk songs. Roman poets employed the refrain in conformity with their Greek models. To conclude with, ancient Roman hymns share characteristics common to other ancient nations, especially with Greeks at first. From Janus' view, hymns have structural and performal correspondences with prayers. They consisted of 3 major parts: invocatio, laus, and preces. Praise and adoration were more important elements in hymns, while in prayers it was preces itself. For this reason, prayers and hymns had a little different functions. At the very beginning, addressing their gods for Romans was a serious duty. However, their addresses, i.e. hymns, were more natural and adapted to spoken language. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for your presentation, and last but not least, for the sticking to time. You are, it took you 20 minutes, so we have some 2 minutes for questions. Yes, please.
I missed one point about the Greek hymn and even the prayer, and this is the voice. The Greek hymn is supposed to be a sacrifice. Something you give to the God, and the voice is compared to the Knise that goes up to heaven, and so I think you can't say it's a play; it's serious as well for the Greek.
Yes.
So,
Yes, I can only confirm that. Yes, hymns were a part of religion, a part of their beliefs. Yes.
Okay, UFO neuntos akuo.
well, but it's in a oracle. It says afterwards, if he doesn't speak, I at least have to use me.
Yes, afterwards. Kai kufos suniemi, kai UFO neuntos akuo. Oh, interesting. Yeah, one more question. Okay, so it's my pleasure to invite Stephan Meyer from the University of Marburg, who is going to present to us his approach to Ovid's concept of humanity. Sorry, I can't help. Sorry.
So good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be re-invited to the Colloquium Balticum, so I may speak to you again about the act of transformation in Ovid's Metamorphosis. My presentation today is based on the one I delivered in Vilnius 3 years ago, in which I talked about the use of manere and nunc quoque in Ovid's Metamorphosis, and how these terms are used to mark a special aspect of continuity during the persons, animals, or God transformation. I came to the conclusion that changes go along with various kinds of continuity, indicated by the words like manere and nunc quoque, but it's not always the main trait of character remaining the same. In the end, I suggested, when dealing with one story in particular, to look for those kinds of words which emphasize a specific aspect of continuity. Now, that's exactly what I would like to do in my presentation today. means antiqua manet, indicates the preservation of Callisto's mind after her transformation, just like means pristina mansit after the metamorphosis of Actaeon. Although it is not explicitly said that Io is still in possession of her own human mind, her actions as a cow have led many interpreters to believe so, and for that reason we might as well take a closer look at the episode of her transformation. Afterwards, we could decide whether or not she keeps her means, or even in her changed form. These three episodes, the transformation of Callisto, Actaeon, and Io, should give us an impression of Ovid's concept of humanity and what it meant to him to be human. It is evident that having that intention in mind, we could analyze other text passages of Ovid's metamorphosis as well, and there are many papers about the philosophical content of the cosmogony in the first book, or Pythagoras' speech in the 15th book, and their significance for the rest of Ovid's work. First of all, a few years ago, Ulrich Schmitzer made clear that the results of this field of research are mutually contradictory, and today I do not want to enter in this discussion. Much more important is the approach I took in my last presentation. By using words like manere and nunc quoque Ovid, presumptively wanted to stress those aspects of metamorphosis which would eventually remain after the change. Therefore, I concentrate in my analysis especially on the following three episodes. The metamorphosis of Io into a cow, which was caused by Jupiter to prevent her from being recognized by Juno. Callisto, who was transformed into a bear by Juno because she gave birth to Jupiter's son. And finally, Actaeon, who turned into a stag because he accidentally saw Diana naked. All three of them keep their old ego and therefore are unable to meet the challenges of the new setting around them. Unfortunately, this fact leads to different consequences in each case. After Io's long and painful journey to Egypt, she finally transforms back into her own body. Callisto runs the risk to get killed by her own son who does not recognize her. In the last second, Jupiter turns them into star constellations. Actaeon suffers the worst fate. He gets ripped apart by his own staghounds. There are two questions I would like to ask in the process of these three episodes. First, which physical abilities get lost during the transformation? Second, which mental abilities are preserved compared to other metamorphoses of land animals? I'm using the term land animals instead of speaking about animals in general because ancient philosophy mainly had this type of animals in mind when it comes to animal intelligence. Moreover, the category of land animals transformation features essential differences to the changes into birds or water animals, which is why they are excluded from my analysis today. The category of transformation into land animal is just one of many categories whose characteristics are analyzed in my examination paper, and it contains 15 episodes. We see Io, Callisto, and Actaeon at the beginning. The transformation of Lycaon is also well known. We also know Odysseus' companion's transformation into pigs, but there are also other smaller ones like Lyncus or Mera. I haven't heard from them before, and I don't expect you to hear from them either. These are really small parts, and they don't really contribute to the concept of being transformed into a land animal, so they are excluded as well. Although Ovid works with many literary sources, his creation of the act of transformation is unique. We cannot find any other description as rich in detail neither in Homer, Hesiod, nor in younger authors like Antonius Liberalis and Boius. I hold the view that if we examine these passages carefully, we will be able to detect Ovid's own ideas and use them for our own discussion. One of the essential attributes of being transformed into a land animal is the loss of speech, and it occurs in every single episode in a certain way. Sometimes the loss of speech itself is the reason for the metamorphosis, and regarding this fact, Diana threatens Actaeon, "Nare si poteris narrare licet," meaning something like, "Go and tell about this incident as long as you can." In other episodes, we hear that a god has taken away, abstulit, the ability to speak, usum verborum, just like Jupiter deals with the Cercopis. Or we learn that from now on, the transformed person produces animal sounds, for example, murmura instead of words, like Hippomenes and Atalanta do. Another attribute of this category is the deprivation of the upright posture. There are many examples of arms like brachia or lacerti being turned into legs in crura, like in Lacaille's change, abeunt in crura lacerti. But sometimes we get a more visual impression of this act, for example, when Okyroe's arms move to the ground. And I always have this image in mind of a horse who's just rearing and goes back to the ground. Her arms move to the herbs to the ground. Finally, Odysseus' companions turn their faces to the earth, in terram toto procumbere vultu. We see that here, in terram toto procumbere vultu. Last but not least, it's the degeneration of the human hand, the part of the body which enables humans to use tools. This aspect is most impressively demonstrated in the scene where Odysseus' companions are no longer able to hold their pocula, their drinking cups, but cause vestigia, footprints, with their former hands. But the process of hands turning into claws can be found elsewhere as well. We have digitio curvantur in Ungues. The hands, they curve into claws. And we have digitio coeunt et quinus ad ligat ungues, the kind of melting into a hoof. Here we see all three categories in all three episodes. Callisto's ability to speak is taken away as well. We already saw this part. And this is from Io's retransformation into a human being. Her transformation has to happen very quickly because Juno is just about to recognize her. So her transformation, it just happens in 1.5 verses. So here she's afraid to speak again because she's frightened of sounding still like a cow. Juno pulls Callisto at her hair, stravit, to the ground, stravit humit prunam, and her arms are switched with legs, and in the retransformation, Io gets her humeri back, and erigito, she stands up. What about the hands? They curve into claws. Here they switch with feet, and Io gets back her hands as well. As I said, in our case, it's the means, the human mind, which is preserved during the change. One would believe that Ovid is the first person who uttered the thought of a human mind trapped into an animal body, but Homer already describes the scene about Odysseus' companions we just talked about and speaks of transformed heads, voices, and bodies. Only the human mind, nous, outlasts the transformation. Unfortunately, Homer gives us no further details about the Min's behavior in this special situation, and even Ovid does not use this chance, at least in this episode. The following questions arise. How can we know to what extent the transformed person is able to accommodate oneself to the new life as an animal? Are we forced to assume that the human mind is lost after a transformation just because its preservation is emphasized in some cases? Fortunately, we have something like an inside man within the metamorphosis into animals, or rather an inside woman. Okyroe, who has insight and fate's secrets and gets punished for telling, is not taken by surprise as her transformation starts. Quite the contrary. She's able to comment on her own transformation and does not skip her mental changes, whether she has already felt them or rather predicts what will happen. First we learn that Okyroe loses her human form. After that, we get informed about her inner change. Herbs will be her food and she likes it. And furthermore, she feels the urge to run across the fields. So there is no connection between these arising interests and actions and her former human life. They are not an indication for her old means, but for her new animal nature. In the following, we will take a closer look on the behavior of the transformed Callisto, Actaeon, and Io to determine the characteristics of the human means. After Callisto's metamorphosis, she indicates her pain by groaning, because she's no longer able to speak the human language. She raises her hands, however they look now, to the sky and its stars. She would like to call Jupiter ungrateful, but she's just able to think the words. There are two aspects of humanity I want to point out in this passage. We've already talked about the loss of speech of a transformed person. But here we see that Callisto still has an understanding of human language, because apparently she's able to form the words in her mind. Another point, Callisto invokes Jupiter. She's aware of the existence of the gods and even takes some kind of prayer position. The first verses after Actaeon's metamorphosis contain two aspects of humanity as well. Being transformed into a stag, he flees in a mad rush and wanders about his speed he's not used to. In the reflection of the water, he finally sees his own changed forms and tries to say me miserum. First of all, Actaeon still shows his understanding of words just like Callisto does. He's in the very act of speaking the words. He has already formed them in his mind, but he can't talk, his voice fails. The second interesting aspect appears when Actaeon looks into the water. He passes the so-called mark test or mirror test. This test was developed in 1970 by psychologists to decide if animals and humans are capable of self-recognition. In the context of this test, the subjects get a colored mark in their faces, for example on the cheek, and are placed in front of a mirror. Humans and animals who touch their own face in order to examine the strange mark prove their capability of recognizing their own reflection instead of looking at someone else's face. And half of all 2-year-old children pass the test, and even some species of great apes. Actaeon proves his self-recognition even in his new body. Instead of noticing a colored mark and touching his face, he sees the horns and an animal face in his water reflection and starts mourning. Actaeon even cries, and overwhelmed as he is, tears run down his face. Although there are other passages in Ovid's Metamorphosis where a transformed person cries, for example Niobe or Myrrha, their sadness is caused by a situation before their metamorphosis. Actaeon, on the other hand, feels this emotion when he's already trapped in the body of an animal. Therefore, the ability to cry and to feel such sadness seem to be yet another sign of his humanity. Quid faciat leads us to the options Actaeon is left with in this situation. He has to consider whether he goes back to his home or hides in the woods. His fear prevents him from doing one thing, his pudency from doing the other. That kind of setting requires huge cognitive abilities because Actaeon has to deliberate all pros and cons until he comes to a decision. Now let's concentrate on Actaeon's motives as he is confronted with the two possible options I mentioned. We all can imagine how any animal can be affected by fear, and even the stag has to watch out for wolves, bears, and hunters, and if he runs into them, the stag has to rely on his speed while escaping. But Actaeon has not met any predators yet. He's just imagining those things, acts them out in his mind, and anticipates future events. What prevents Actaeon from going home and showing himself in this new animal form is his pudor, his sense of shame and modesty. While we consider the timor to be an animal emotion as well, there is no way we would put something like shame or modesty past any animal. Therefore, pudor is a genuine human characteristic as well. Just like Actaeon, Io passes the mark or mirror test of self-recognition, actually maybe in two ways. Before she sees her reflection in the water, Io hears her new voice, or rather her mooing, and gets frightened by the sound of it. She knows that she produced it, but her voice should not sound like that. Io is aware of the difference between her former voice and the growling she has just heard. The scene at the water is comparable to the one with Actaeon pretty well. Io looks into the waves and realizes that this strange image looking at her is her own. Instead of just noticing a colored mark, Io is terrified of her new horns in this face. Later in the scene, we see Io trying to tell her family about her metamorphosis, but due to this physiology of a new tongue, she's not able to accomplish that. But just like Callisto and Actaeon, Io demonstrates that she is able to form the words in her mind, and even excels her fellow sufferers in this situation. She uses her animal foot, her hoof, to write down her name in the sand. Although Io has lost her hands and is stuck in a cow's body, she is still capable of operating the writing system and communicates with her family. At last, Io proves her conception of the gods when she rises her face to the stars and mourns her fate like Callisto did. There are even tears, the evidence of her emotional condition, which remind us of Actaeon as he showed us his grief and despair of his fate. Let's look back to all these criteria of humanity we faced so far. First, the physical features. Humans walk on two legs and therefore have an upright walk, so they look straight ahead, not to the ground. They have two hands, thanks to which they are able to reach for things and hold them. They can talk. The constitution of their tongue allows them to articulate words. And now the mental features. Humans are also able to form the words in their mind and think them. Using the writing system, they can communicate their thoughts without even telling. They are aware of the existence of gods. They invoke them while they look at the sky and its stars or raise their arms to them. They are able to consider different options of actions and they are able to reflect on them. They can anticipate future events, which allows them to plan ahead their action. They feel shame. They have a concept of what is decent and honorable and what is not. They can be overwhelmed by sadness. They are capable of feeling this strong emotion and they even cry. They pass the mirror or mark test. They prove their ability of self-recognition when they hear their voice and see their reflection on a mirror. When we look at this list describing Ovid's concept of humanity based on the metamorphosis into land animals, especially the one of Callisto, Actaeon, and Io, we have to ask which philosophical ideas we have had an influence on Ovid. May there be a direct or an indirect link between them. I cannot give you a satisfying answer today, but approaching the end of my presentation, I want to point out two interesting passages in Urs Dierauer's Tier und Mensch im Denken der Antike, or at least I summarized them because of the time.
It's okay, you have some 2 minutes.
Okay, that's perfect. The ability of the upright walk, the use of the hands and the voice is mentioned everywhere. Anaxagoras tells about the man's helpful hands. Some other people talk about the upright walk, and the use of the voice appears everywhere. And in his last chapter of Dierauer, he summarizes the Stoic point of view of the relation between humans and animals concerning their mental abilities. He talks about 6 main topics: the awareness of gods, perception of time, freedom in judging and acting, goodness and badness, the effects, and the ability to speak. And as a matter of fact, they all match to the characteristics I presented to you earlier. I would like to talk to you about that maybe during the break.
Okay.
And at last, Dierauer calls the ability to speak. No, that's not the point. So I think we have good reasons to assume that there are some Stoic influences on Ovid's concept of humanity. At last, I want to point to another aspect concerning the Io episodes. There's a question if there's a connection to Xenophon's Memorabilia, because he talks about the human mind trapped into a cow's body, and this type of creature would not be able to act as a human creature, but I think Ovid disproves that theory. I always wondered why there's no use of manere in non quoque in the Io episode, although it's the first and the longest of these 3 transformations. And I think maybe the preservation of Io's mind is not anticipated by using these terms, so the reader has to realize that on his mind, along the story, because he's confronted again and again with her human behavior. So later in the episode of Callisto and Actaeon, Ovid is able to use these terms of continuity by saying mens antiqua manet and mens pristina mansit. And in doing so, he emphasizes the specific aspect of continuity which illustrates Ovid's concept of humanity we've already been able to discover in the Io episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Maybe 1 or 2 questions? Yeah, please. Martina, and then please, Martina.
Thank you, Stephan. I just have a comment. I don't know if it is of interest for you to your study, but you mentioned this loss of speech, and I'm thinking of 2 other characters in the Metamorphosis, namely Echo, who doesn't transform into an animal, but still, forbids her to speak. She can just make echoes. And also Philomela, who gets her tongue cut off and therefore tells her story in her weaving. So I think this is a recurring motive in Ovid, that the characters lose their ability to speak. Just a comment. It could be interesting.
Yeah, thank
perhaps.
you for that.
Ben, please. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a short remark with respect to the philosophical ideas. You were wondering about the possible sources, but I'm just thinking that it's a commonsensical dualism that's operating there. I mean, a lot of people simply think that the mind is something separate from the body, so they think that the mind can survive the body and migrate through different other bodies or whatever you like. So I don't think you need to really look very far. Or maybe it's just a Platonic influence that has survived throughout the ancient philosophy.
I was wondering about these characteristics I found, like the existence of God, who talks about the existence of God concerning mental ability of a human person, who talks about self-awareness, who talks about
so you were
are able
for
to
specific characters?
yes.
Okay.
I really like the book of Urs Dierauer, Tier und Mensch im Denken der Antike, and he I already have it here. And he gives us an overview from the 5th pre-Christian century to Plato, Aristoteles, Epicurus, and Stoics. And as I was reading the Stoic chapter, I thought it's all here. So I'm looking for that, for these specific aspects. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Smart.
Might work in Ovid, but in the Odyssey, a nous can be a character as well, or political possession. And the context of the simile is that the animal similes of the Odyssey, it's different in the Iliad, might suggest that the verse means his nous has not to be transmogrified, but they already were animal.
Mm-hmm. They changed into a bad form. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No,
as
it's
well Semonides.
Okay. Thank you. Well, and yes, I would like to invite Martina Björk from University of Lund.
Thank you.
She's going also to speak on Ovid. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, Ovid needs no further presentation, but what is an etopoeia? Etopoeia is Greek for the creating of a character, the creating of an ethos. It is known from rhetorical handbooks from Aristotle and forward, Aristotle's rhetoric. The etopoeia was practiced in ancient schools as one of the prognosmata, preliminary rhetorical exercises which were designed to train oratory and writing, and we heard Kadri mention them yesterday. I can't see you now, but the teacher read aloud from an old master, often Homer. Then the student was supposed to memorize the text, reshape it with the help of the prognosma, sometimes even converting the text from Greek to Latin or from poetry into prose. The etopoeia is a monologue which catches a person, and this person is often a historical mythological character, and it catches him or her in an often critical, dramatic, tragic situation. And the etopoeia writes the words that he or she would utter in this certain situation. The writer of the etopoeia should pay regard to the intended speaker's age, gender, social background, as well as the recipient, the time and the place, in short, the whole situation. The prognosmata rhetos divided the etopoeia into 3 periods of time. present, past, and future. The speaker should begin in the present in medias res with a lament about the situation. And then he should continue with the past and finally close with a wish, a prayer, or prediction of the future. One reader, Nicolaus the Sophist, also recommends that the speaker should turn to the present right before the future. The Prognosmata Rhetor from the 4th century AD writes headlines to his etopoeia, his model texts. And they go like, what words would X say in a certain situation? For example, what words would Medea say when she is about to murder her children? What words would Andromache say over the dead Hector? What words would Ajax say when he is about to kill himself? What words would Achilles say when hearing of the death of Patroclus? The Prognosmata encouraged in sophistic tradition to think from different angles and views, and for a future lawyer or writer, the ability to live the part of both friend and enemy was considered important, to speak pro and contra the same topic. Or in this case, to write an etopoeia of Achilles, and thereafter the corresponding one, delivered by his greatest rival Hector. Let me summarize excuse me, a model text from Libanius, the etopoeia of Niobe. You probably know the story. Niobe is the happy mother of 12 children. Unluckily, she boasts about her children before Leto, the mother of Artemis and Apollo. And Leto sends her twin children to kill all Niobe's children. So, what words would Niobe say when her children lie dead? Oh, what suffering! All my children lie dead. I have no longer children, but instead an amount of tears. The present situation in medias res. I was arrogant when I competed with the children of the mighty. I should never have been a mother. I was happy, so I believed, but happiness often weakens one's mind. I sinned and should have died. Oh, for the former hopes and this change. I thought I was to arrange weddings for my children. The past. Niobe tells us her ideas of what led to the catastrophe. She expresses contrafactual ideas and a wish to have the past undone or changed. Next. Whom will I first mourn? What sort of life awaits me? The release I can think of is either change into a senseless thing, either hang myself, throw myself into the sea, or against rocks, or give myself a mortal wound. Here Niobe reflects on the future and makes a prediction. We know that she will turn into a senseless thing, stone. Niobe speaks to no one but herself, or perhaps to destiny. She is like an opera singer stepping forward, singing her aria for a few minutes, crying out her sorrow. However, the etopoeia can be addressed to a recipient, but the speaker of the etopoeia cannot expect to get any feedback. Now, has Ovid anything to do with this school exercise? Let me give a pair of examples of short monologues from Ovid's Metamorphoses. First is from Book 10, in which Apollo mourns his beloved Hyacinthus, who is killed when the two are throwing the discus. Jealous but invisible western wind Zephyros catches hold of the discus and throws it into Hyacinthus' head. After his death, the flower hyacinth grows from his blood. The situation presented by Ovid can be outlined. What words would Apollo say when the discus that he throws hits his beloved Hyacinthus and kills him? First comes a section in which Apollo comments the present calamity. Oh, sorry. There is a picture missing here. Okay, I will. No, there is a line missing. Okay, only a line. I will read it. Laberis oibalide prima fraudate juventa, foibus ait vidioque tuum mea crimina vulnus, tu dolores facinusque meum mea dextra leto, inscribenda tuos dego sum tibi funeris auctor. Hyacinthus, son of Oibalos, Apollo says, you perish, deluded in the prime of youth. I can see in your wound my own guilt. You are the cause of my grief and self-reproach. My own hand is guilty of your death. I am the author of your destruction. Apollo continues by reflecting on what caused the death, using the perfect tense. Quae mea culpa tamen nisi silus isse vocari, culpa potest nisi culpa potestet amasse vocari, at cutinam merito vitam tecumque leceret reddere. What was my crime? Could it be called a crime to have played with you? Could it be called a crime to have loved you? I wish it had been possible to give my life together with you. Note the last sentence here. We again meet a wish to change the past. Now, after having lamented the present situation, reflected on the past, and expressed a wish of changing the course of events, Apollo looks forward and speaks of the future. Quod quoniam fatali legete nemur, semper eris micum memorique haerebis in ore. Te lyra pulsa manu te carmina nostra sonabunt. Flosque novus scripto gemitus imitabere nostros. Tempus et illud erit, quo se fortissimus heros, adat in hunc florem folioque legator eodem. Although we are restrained by the law of destiny, you will always be with me, and you will dwell upon my remembering lips. The lyre, characteristic for Apollo, struck by my hand will praise you, as will my songs. As a new flower, you will imitate my moans with markings on your petals. There will come a time when a valiant hero shall link himself to this flower and be known by the same marks upon its petals. So Apollo expresses his emotions in a tragic situation. 3 tenses are presented in the order that the handbook writers advised. As Apollo speaks to Hyacinthus, but he's dead and he cannot expect any reply. And another passage, and you recognize this. It's about Inachus and Io. And you heard the story. Jupiter has transformed Io into a cow. And when Io's father, the immortal Inachus, discovers this horrible transformation, he bursts out. So, what words would Inachus say when he discovers that his daughter Io has transformed into a cow? Me miser ingemina tu nesquae sita per omnes nata mihi terras tu non inventa reperta luctus eras levior retices nec mutua nostris dicta refers alto tantum suspiria ducis pectore quod cunum potes ad mea verba remugis. Poor me, he shouts. You are then my daughter whom I have sought over the world. You were a lighter grief, unfound than found. You are silent and give no replies to me. You only give sigh deeply from your heart, and you moo to my words, the only thing you can do. The present situation. Then follows the hopes he had for her, and now confer to Niobe. Atti begignarus talamos taidasque parabam, spesque fuit generi mihi prima secunda nepotum. In my naivety, I prepared for wedding. I hoped for a son-in-law and for grandchildren. And so his fears of the future. Degregenunc tibi virnunc degregenatus habendus, nec finire licet tantos mihi morte dolores. Sed nocet esse Deum praeclusaque janua leti, aeternum nostros luctus extendit in aebum. Now you must have a husband from the flock, and then a son from the flock. It is not possible for me to finish such pains through death. To be a god is a detrimental thing. The closed door to death extends my grief to eternal time. This short passage comprises only 11 lines. Still, the ingredients of the Ithopoeia are here: the monologue, the dramatic situation, the emotions, the three tenses, and the lack of reply. The Heroides, or Epistolae Heroidum by Ovid, have been compared to progymnasmata, and especially the Ithopoeia. And when I first made acquaintance with this collection of letter poems, I was struck by the rhetorical character. Poems abound of arguments, rhetorical figures, recurring topoi. To my surprise, though, the claimed resemblance to progymnasmata has been controversial. And the view has been that the label of Ithopoeia is limiting, pejorative, and thus the idea has often been brushed aside and never really explored. An example, Howard Jacobson, who in 1974 wrote a standard work on the Herodes, writes, "All this similarity, ides to the Ithopoeia, is large illusion, for the gulf between the Herodes and these Ithopoeia is unbridgeable." Let us see if he's right. We already saw a pair of examples from the Metamorphoses. So first of all, a short presentation of the first collection. I concentrate on the first collection of the Herodes here. It consists of 15 fictitious letters in elegiac meter, written by women from Greek-Roman mythology to their lovers, who never write any replies. Of course. The situations are tragic, dramatic. We meet the women in the most critical situations of their lives. And if I were to make headings for the letters, because Ovid doesn't, but if I were, they would be, "What words would Penelope write to Ulysses when she hears that the soldiers return from Troy, but her husband does not? What words would Phyllis write to Demophon when he has not returned from Athens as he promised? Briseis write to Achilles after being abducted by Agamemnon? Phaedra, to the left, write to her stepson Hippolytus when she realizes that she is in love with him and decides to reveal her feelings for him. Oenone write to Paris when he has met Helen. What words would Hypsipyle write to Jason upon the news that he has met Medea? Dido write to Aeneas when he is leaving Carthage. Hermione write to Orestes after being married against her will to Pyrrhus. Deianira write to Hercules when she hears that he has fallen in love with Iole. What words would Ariadne write to Theseus when she finds herself abandoned by him on a desert island? Cannace write to her brother and lover Macarius when she is about to end her life with a sword handed from her father. Medea write to Jason when he is marrying a Corinthian princess. Laodamia write to Protesilaus when he has left to fight in the Trojan War. What words would Hippamestra write to Lynceus from jail after having spared his life, while her sisters have killed their husbands? Sappho write to Phaon when he has left for Sicily. Mostly, a heroine starts with the present by complaining her fate. After that, she tells her lover how it used to be, or what led to the catastrophe. The present and the past often overlap each other, but the letter always concludes with the future. And not rarely the heroine goes back to the present just before concluding with the future, as Nicolaus the sophist advised. Now, due to the shortness of time, I will confine myself to only one presentation of a heroine, namely Hippamestra. And we meet her as she sits in jail. And she was the only one of 50 sisters who did not obey her father's command to kill her husband, and for that crime she's imprisoned. Her letter goes as follows, and it is almost 200 verses long, so I will here just summarize it. She says, "Here I sit in jail, chained by my father. My crime is that I was too pious to kill my husband. I do not regret that. My heart is pounding when I think of last night. We sisters were commanded to kill our husbands during our wedding night. I heard my brothers-in-law screaming as they were killed. The thought of killing you, Linkevs, made me shake by fear. Therefore, I spared your life. And at the end, she goes back to the present. My family is at war. I have lost both sisters and brothers. And, at last, the future. A wish. Save me, Linkevs, or have my corpse buried. Now, other heroine epistles follow more or less this standard structure of time and include these topoi. So, if we understand the Herodes as modeled on the Ethnopoeia, we can more easily interpret elements that have been regarded as oddities or flaws. For example, one scholar comments on the fact that Kanneke, a teenage girl who falls in love with her brother and gives birth to his son, in her letter tells Macarius about the love affair and her pregnancy, so on and so on. And this, claims the scholar, is redundant information, since Macarius, of course, already is aware of all this, and so is the ancient reader or listener. But to account for past events, that's part of the Ethnopoeia. It is expected. In the Herodes, we have repetitions, sudden outbursts, contradictions, irrationalities, and these have gained critique among scholars because they do not fit into aesthetic ideals. But I think these so-called flaws can be explained when we understand that the speeches are meant to seem spontaneous, unprepared, delivered in panic. There's no time for the women to make a draft when they write the letters. They speak here and now. These unrestrained gushes of emotions can also be explained by the fact that women are expected to speak in that manner. Cicero, for example, writes in his Tusculanae Disputationes that it characterizes woman to cry and scratch her cheeks. And believe me, she does that in Herodes several times. It is part of their ethos, and what must be convincing is the ethos, the character, not the speaker's rhetoric. So if the women are confused, emotionally upset, and lack the ability to persuade or be convincing in the message, that might be the point. The text shall characterize them and reveal their shortcomings. The progymnasmata are encouraged to look at the subject from different perspectives. And this is what Ovid does in the Herodes. Instead of writing the stories of Ulysses, Achilles, Theseus, Jason, Paris, and Aeneas, Ovid gives voice to their girlfriends. The men never get the chance to defend themselves. Thus, the similarities with Ethnopoeia are not illusions, and the gulf between Ethnopoeia and Herodes is not unbridgeable. The purpose of the school Ethnopoeia and the progymnasmata was to learn to think broadly and to improve one's writing. It was a tool which provided frames for the dramatic monologue. And in fact, we find the Ethnopoeia even in the Greek tragedies. And I will give you one example from another female heroine from Greek myth, Alcestis from Euripides. Alcestis is the wife of Admetos, who is doomed by the gods to die if he cannot find anyone else willing to enter the gates of Hades. When his parents say no, Alcestis, his wife, offers herself to die in his place. So what words would Alcestis say when she is about to be sacrificed? Adme thoras gartamagr pragmathos echei, lexai thelosoi printhanein abulomai. Admetus, since you see how things stand with me, I want to tell you before I die what I wish. These are the introductory lines of Alcestis' speech, and she continues in my summary. I did not want to live, bereft of you, together with fatherless children. I gave you my youth. Your parents, who should have sacrificed themselves, betrayed you. If they had saved you, we could have lived together and you had not been a widower. I ask you of this. Bring up the children to become masters. Let no stepmother take care of them. In a while I will be among the dead. Tell others that you were married to the noblest of women. And by now I think you recognize this pattern, this structure. The Epopea is thus not only a simple exercise reserved for Greek and Roman schools. It is part of a literal tradition. The student was to learn to write in the manner that the old masters did, and the Progymnasmata handbooks gave the writer tools for that. However, Ovid, as far as I can see, seems to be rather unique in using it in another genre than drama, and in making it as an isolated text. He was known for his playfulness, not least regarding genres. It was he who mocked the didactic poem when he wrote a manual on amatory persuasion and not on agriculture. In the Metamorphoses, he follows the path of his predecessors, but searches and develops at the same time new directions. And here, I believe, he pushes the borders somewhat forward again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, but I am very sorry we have no time for questions. So please keep your questions to the time of the coffee break. And now I would like to render the floor to...
This is really sad.
Yes, we have no time. And Bernadetta Banaszkiewicz from the University of Marburg. She's going to explain us something about ekphrasis und Intensität. Yeah?
Thank you. I think I have to stay to use the space. Okay. I don't have any pictures, so you just have to close your eyes and imagine something. Thank you, Vita, and thank you, Ilse, for the invitation. I'm really very, very pleased to be here, part of our Colloquium Balticum. To those of you who have difficulties in understanding German language, take the handout, please, and follow the numbers. I will raise my hand and show you the number where we are, because I put it in 2 languages there, and with the Greek, so I think you might be able, I hope so, to follow what I'm going to talk about. Denn mein Vortrag heute ist auf Deutsch. Ich möchte gerne folgendermaßen beginnen. Bitte schließen Sie die Augen und stellen Sie sich vor, es wäre noch einmal vorgestern. Ja? Wir kommen in die kleine Gilde und Sie stellen sich dieses Haus vor beim Eintreten. Dann sind wir genau da, wo ich Sie hinführen will heute, nämlich in die Palastbeschreibungen in der Odyssee. Ja? Ich zitiere. Hostega Eliu ai glepelen zelenis, domakat hypserefes megaletoros alkinoio, chalkoi men gar toichoi lelelat enta kaienta, es myron ex udu peride trinkos pyanoio. Shruse aide tyrai pykinon domanentos ergon, stat moitar gyreoi, en schalke og hester sanudo, argurion, der Hertyrion, Chrysée, der Corone und so weiter und so weiter. Ich unterbreche hier und gehe zur deutschen Übersetzung. Erki, bitte überprüfen, ob ich homertauglich übersetze. Denn ein Glanz lag auf den erst hoch oben abgeschlossenen Gebäuden des herrlich mütigen Alkinoos wie der Glanz der Sonne oder des Mondes. Denn es verhielt sich so, dass Wände aus geschlagenem Eisen sich dahin und dorthin erstreckten, von der Schwelle an bis ins Innere der Anlage, und rings lief blauer Lasurstein um. Golden waren die Innentore, die das Haus dicht verschlossen. Silberne Pfosten standen auf einer Schwelle aus Erz. Aus Silber war der Platz über der Türe, aus Gold die Öse des Riegels. Links und rechts befanden sich Hunde aus Silber, vergoldete. Die waren von Hephaistos selbst bereitet worden, mit vorzüglicher Kennerschaft und so fort und so fort. Es ist üblich in der Odyssee, dass ein Haus bei der ersten Erwähnung im Verlauf der Handlung beschrieben wird, wenn eine Person in es eintritt. Dabei zeigen das entsprechende Haus und sein Bewohner eine Relation zueinander auf. Einige Eigenschaften des Bewohners werden durch die Beschreibung des Anwesens mit abgebildet. Insbesondere sind hier Eigenschaften zu nennen, die für aristokratisch orientierte Gesellschaftsformen Relevanz besitzen, wie etwa Reichtum und Adel. Dieses Muster finden wir in 13 Fällen angewendet in der Odyssee, wenn das Haus ein auffälliges Haus ist, ein Taumaton, und oder in den Fällen, wo es um das Haus eines Fremden geht. Die griechischen Wörter, die in der Odyssee für diese Anwesen benutzt werden, sind Speos sowie Megaron, also Höhle, Grotte oder Männersaal, außerdem Doma und ganz oft, wie wir alle wissen, im Plural. Ja? Sehr häufig sind die Kombinationen Domata Kala oder Domata Agaklya. Es geht also immer um eine Beschreibung, also eine Kombination aus Substantiv und Adjektiv in den Fällen. So yes, for the English speaking number one, please, on the handout, there I have put a list. I have there put a list of 19 occasions to describe a palace or a house or something, but I only talk about 13. You will see why. Einige Male kommt es nicht zu einem Fokus auf ein Haus. Beim Angriff auf die Kikonen etwa werden die Häuser von Ismaros nicht beschrieben. Dasselbe gilt für den Angriff der Laistrygonen auf die Männer von Ithaka. Wie wir sofort sehen, geht es in diesen Fällen jeweils um feindliche und nicht um freundliche Begegnungen. So dürfen wir formulieren: Immer, wenn eine Figur in der Odyssee freundliche Aufnahme findet und der Figur das Haus ihres Gastgebers entweder fremd ist oder es sich um ein erstaunliches Gebäude handelt oder beides, dann wird es ausführlich beschrieben. Ich spreche daher bei den Palastbeschreibungen von einem Topos in der Odyssee. Aus diesen 13 Beschreibungen habe ich 3 ausgewählt und auf das Textblatt gesetzt, um 3 verschiedene Dinge heute anzusprechen. Erstens, ich möchte für eine strukturalistische Interpretation von diesem Topos plädieren. Zweitens, ich möchte für eine funktionale Definition von Ekphrasis plädieren. Und drittens geht es dann noch um die Intensität. Werden Sie dann sehen. Erstens, nach meiner Auffassung ist die Topik des Musters so streng verfolgt in der Odyssee, dass nicht nur die Variatio der Beschreibungen analysiert und interpretiert werden sollten, sondern streng strukturalistisch gedacht, muss die Differenz zum Normfall auch dann als bedeutungstragend aufgefasst werden, wenn die Beschreibung verschoben, abgebrochen oder ersetzt wird. Dies möchte ich an der Palastbeschreibung des Menelaos verdeutlichen. Ich werde behaupten, dass die beiden Themen Nützlichkeit und Freundschaft im 4. Gesang den Raum zugewiesen erhalten, den topischerweise eine Palastbeschreibung an der Stelle erhielte. Und damit eben auch ein Enkomion des Reichtums. Deswegen habe ich als konkreten Titel für dieses Handout gewählt Palastbeschreibung in der Odyssee. Das ist dieser erste Kreis. Doch nun möchte ich dieses Thema in 2 Themenkreise einbetten. Die werden wir vielleicht nur in der Diskussion dann berühren können. Erstens möchte ich dafür plädieren, alle diese Beschreibungen als Ekphrases anzusehen. Nach dem Verständnis der antiken Rhetoriker, und die ältesten Definitionen zur Ekphrasis kommen von diesen Progymnasmata-Autoren, von denen wir heute schon so gehört haben und gestern auch von Kadri, die definieren Ekphrases als Beschreibungen, die besonders deutliche mentale Bilder erzeugen. Diese Bilder werden genannt Enargeis. Das Differenzkriterium zwischen einer normalen Beschreibung und einer Ekphrasis ist also die Enargeia, nach deren Theorie. Wie will ich nun aber behaupten, dass die Palastbeschreibungen besonders deutliche mentale Bilder hervorrufen? Was weiß ich, was Sie sich gerade vorgestellt haben. War es die Gilde? Ja? Und warum sollte man den vorgestellten Topos der Palastbeschreibung als Palast-Ekphrases ansehen? Nun, ich teile Ihnen natürlich jetzt Fragebögen aus mit einer Skala von 1 bis 10. Dort können Sie Kreuzchen von sehr deutlich bis undeutlich einsetzen. Und bei der repräsentativen Größe der Teilnehmer des Colloquium Balticum 2014 in Riga veröffentliche ich in einem halben Jahr ein Paper mit den Ergebnissen in Science, ein Hoch den empirischen Wissenschaften. Damit sind wir schon beim Warum, Sie merken schon, wie ich das auffasse. Mit der Forschung zur Ekphrasis stehen wir sozusagen am Ursalat der Philologie, an der Semiotik. Wir stehen an der Stellvertreterfunktion des Wortes. Gelingt es einem Autor, das Signifié, das Bedeutete, in die Köpfe der Rezipienten zu zaubern, dann nennen die Rhetoriker dies Enargeia. Es geht also um die Mühelosigkeit oder um die Intensität der Vorstellung. Mit der Forschung zur Ekphrasis sind wir also bei der Analyse der Vorstellungsbildung. Dieses Feld geben wir allerdings momentan, so wie ich das beobachte, etwa seit 20 Jahren, generös den Kognitionswissenschaftlern und den Medienwissenschaftlern und so weiter ab. Die Bild-Text-Debatte folgt jedoch den Definitionen der antiken Rhetoriker nicht. Sie definieren Ekphrasis mit Hilfe der Begriffe Repräsentation und Kunst. And no wonder that then, of course, things get lost. Also Sie können sich sofort vorstellen, wie die Debatte zur Ekphrasis in der Moderne aussieht. Also mindestens 5, 6 verschiedene Lager. Mein Plädoyer daher: A. Lassen wir uns unsere Gegenstände nicht aus der Hand nehmen. B. Helfen wir den Literatur-, Kunst- und Medienwissenschaftlern in der Bild-Text-Debatte auf. C. Lassen Sie uns nicht zu Fragebögen greifen, sondern zu Definitionen, die sich an der Funktion eines Textelements orientieren. Nach meiner Ansicht, um das gleich anzuschließen, übernehmen die Palastbeschreibungen folgende Funktion und sind daher Ekphrasis. Erstens, also so eine Beschreibung regt ein mentales Bild an. Zweitens, es löst eine Emotion aus. Das heißt, wenn es um angenehme Wohnsituationen und Häuser geht, dann wird bei einem ergötzlichen Bild, das stimuliert werden soll, auch eine behagliche Emotion ausgelöst. Ja? Es geht dann um Sicherheit, wie wir auf Deutsch so schön sagen können, Gemütlichkeit. Drittens, die Beschreibung eines Hauses lässt ein Vorurteil über den Bewohner entstehen. Vorurteil meine ich hier nach Gadamer. Ja? Das heißt, wir nehmen eine kleine Szene, die Sie alle kennen aus Homer. Wenn Sie Regale geschrieben bekommen, die an Wänden umlaufen, Holznäpfe, Körbchen in einer Grotte, dann entsteht das Bild eines hirtischen Bewohners, der mit Milchwirtschaft zu tun hat. Ja? Und eben nicht das Bild von einem menschenfressenden Kyklopen. D. Mit dieser Ahnung zum Bewohner ist immer natürlich dann in der Odyssee bei diesen Fremdheitssituationen verknüpft. Geht es um Freund, geht es um Feind, geht es um Gefahr, geht es um Sicherheit. C, und dies ist der Punkt auch heute, mit diesem mentalen Bild wird auch immer die Position des Beschriebenen im Wertesystem des Rezipienten angesprochen. Das heißt, wenn eine Palastbeschreibung abgebrochen wird, denke ich, müssen wir auch über den Wert von Reichtum nachdenken, wenn denn der Reichtum in dieser Stelle unterbrochen wird. Mein dritter Punkt, beziehungsweise also dieser zweite Themenkreis, in den ich das ganze Feld Ekphrasis, Vorstellungsbildung einordnen möchte, hat mit dem zweiten Begriff meines angekündigten Titels zu tun, nämlich dem Begriff Intensität. Do not wonder that you don't get any numbers, it will come. Mit der antiken griechischen Rhetorik und Philosophie haben wir Zugriff auf zwei Konzepte der Deutlichkeit, auf die Enargeia, zu der habe ich genug gesagt, und auf die Sapheneia. Während die Enargeia die Mühelosigkeit und die Intensität der Vorstellungsbildung berücksichtigt, das heißt also die Leistung des Rezipienten inkludiert, gewinnt die Sapheneia ihre Deutlichkeit nur aus dem Gegenstand. Nach meiner Auffassung trennen sich hier auch ein subjektives und ein nur objektives Konzept der Deutlichkeit. Mit der Forschung zur Ekphrasis können wir an einen Strang der europäischen Geistesgeschichte anknüpfen, der durch die Überbetonung der Objektivität, nennen wir es Erzeugung von Wissenschaftlichkeit im Sinne der Aufklärung, der uns da verloren gegangen ist. Das heißt, ich würde gerne das ganze Thema Ekphrasis auch in eine Epistemologie einordnen wollen. Kommen wir damit zu meinen 3 Beispielen auf dem Textblatt. Das heißt, für die Englischleute, number 2 please on the handout. Viele der Palastbeschreibungen der Odyssee folgen dem Schema, das die Descriptio des Palastes von Alkinoos vorgibt. Die genaue Beschreibung von Farbe, Glanz und Material der Außentüren, Innentüren, Wandverkleidungen, Altäre, von der Ausstattung des Eingangsbereiches und der Gästehallen, der Anzahl der Sklaven etc. ist so detailliert und ausführlich, dass für jeden Rezipienten von einer deutlichen Vorstellungsbildung des Anwesens ausgegangen werden darf, das heißt von en Argea. Doch mehr als das. Nicht das Haus wird eigentlich durch den Narrator beschrieben, nein, der entsprechende Protagonist selbst wird als Bewunderer und Staunender beschrieben. Und das haben wir hier gleich am Anfang. Nummer 2, you see Polla de Heuker Hormein Histameno. Ja? Es wird eigentlich Odysseus beschrieben, wie er dort staunt. Sehr stark bewegte sich ihm das Herz. Und dann haben wir das nochmal am Ende. Bitte schauen Sie auf Vers 133, Seite 3 ist das. Der Abschluss. Entas, das, Theeito, Polytlas, Dios, Odysseus und so weiter. Ja? Hier stand der göttliche Odysseus und der war Polytlas, ja? Also konzessiv würde ich fast denken, das Epitheton, der Starke im Aushalten und starrte lange alles an. Und erst nachdem er alles mit seinem Empfinden bestaunt und gewertet hatte, ja, dann geht er hinein. Angesichts des Palasts verwandelt sich Odysseus für einen Moment aus einem Handelnden in einen Betrachter. Der Sprechakt Enkomion, der Preis der Schönheit eines Hauses, wird hier also einer Figur in den Blick gelegt. Das Staunen ist als Handlung in eine Form gebracht und rahmt den Fokus auf den Palast. Diese Form der Beschreibung des Staunenden regt den Rezipienten an, gleichfalls als Betrachter vor dem Palast des Alkinoos zu stehen und zu staunen. Der Rezipient wird angeregt, das Zuhören für einen Moment zu vergessen und stattdessen das Evozierte innerlich zu betrachten. Es ist davon auszugehen, dass diese Form der Rahmung der Beschreibung eines Gebäudes den Rezipienten dazu anregt, nicht nur die Details des Palastes vorzustellen, sondern gleichfalls zu bewundern. Das heißt, die gewünschte affektive Wirkung, die Emotion, wird ausgelöst. Kommen wir damit zu Nummer 3 auf dem Handout, die Beschreibung der Grotte Kalypsos. Die Beschreibung erfolgt genau, wie wir es in der letzten Szene gesehen haben. Der Narrator beschreibt die staunenden Wahrnehmungen des Gottes Hermes. Während dies indes in der letzten Szene zu Beginn und zum Ende der Beschreibung explizit gemacht wurde, erfährt der Rezipient dies hier erst am Ende. Ja, wir haben wieder die Beschreibung von diesem Staunen bei Hermes, aber es ist erst am Ende. Die Beschreibung eröffnet mit dem allgemeinen Zeichen der Zivilisation einer Insel, mit dem Feuer und wendet sich dann zu dieser ungewöhnlichen Frau, bevor die Grotte und ihre Umgebung beschrieben wird. Und dann haben wir am Ende in Vers 75 geht das los, wieder diese Beschreibung des Staunens, ja. Te, seit oder idon, kai, terfteie, de fräsen, häsen. Da haben wir auch noch terpomai, ja, also terpestei, kommt noch die Beschreibung von diesem Ergötzen und dem Gefühl dazu. Diese 2 Beispiele sollen genug sein für den Topos. Jetzt Nummer 4 auf dem Handout. Beim Palast von Menelaos läuft alles anders. Die topische Beschreibung wird in dem Moment, wo die Jungs zu dem Palast kommen, Telemachos und Pisistratos, wird verschoben. Ja? Man müsste eigentlich gleich am Anfang von Gesang 4 jetzt irgendwie zu diesem Haus kommen, kommt nicht. Stattdessen wird das Fest beschrieben, das im Hause läuft. B. In dem Moment, in dem die Jungs an die Außentore kommen und die Pferde abgeschirrt werden, ist der nächste gute Moment, in dem nun diese Palastbeschreibung aber nachgeholt werden sollte. Ja? Stattdessen wird in der Handlung vorangetrieben, wie der Diener diese Gäste anmelden will. Also 2. Verschiebung. C. Der Abbruch der Beschreibung von Menelaos, nämlich die beiden Jungs kommen jetzt ins Haupthaus, innen in das Megaron, und tatsächlich ist die Gelegenheit da, zu beschreiben. Und tatsächlich wird jetzt gesagt, dass sie staunen und sich das Haus ansehen, aber der Narrator bricht ab zugunsten der Beschreibung, wie sie denn jetzt ins Bad kommen und ein Bad erhalten. Das heißt, hier wird die Beschreibung angefangen, abgebrochen, ersetzt durch eine andere Beschreibung. D. In dem Moment, in dem diese Jungs nun gewaschen sind, sauber, neue Kleidung, man hat gegessen, ja, flüstern die einander am Tisch zu, boah, guck dich mal um hier, wie sieht's hier toll aus, ja? Wieder diese Codewörter, die 2 Hexameter zum Glanz und zu den Materialien. Und das heißt, natürlich erwartet man, dass jetzt die detaillierte Beschreibung von dem Palast einsetzt. Stattdessen aber hört Menelaos, dass die beiden Jungs sich über seinen Palast unterhalten und unterbricht sie. Also wieder wird die Palastbeschreibung abgebrochen und Menelaos sagt an der Stelle, ich würde wirklich alles gerne hergeben. Alles ist zu viel für einen Griechen gedacht, ja? Der Grieche sagt natürlich 2/3, aber das ist eine ganze Masse für einen Menelaos, ja? 2/3 von meinem Reichtum würde ich hergeben, sehr gerne. Soll das Haus hier anders aussehen, wenn nur Agamemnon noch am Leben wäre und Odysseus hier. Das heißt, ich behaupte, an der Stelle ist ein Enkomion von dem Leben der Freunde und der Nützlichkeit der Freundschaft. Aber wir sind noch nicht am Ende. Nicht nur, dass Menelaos jetzt zu diesem Ersatzenkomion ansetzt, sondern ja, Menelaos wird seinerseits unterbrochen, Auftritt Helena. Helena kommt aber nicht allein, sie kommt mit 2 Dienerinnen und die Dienerinnen haben das berühmte Wollekörbchen der Königin von Ägypten, ja, Alkandre, dabei. Sie haben das alle irgendwann mal machen müssen, im Studium nehme ich an. Ja, und dann kommt eine genaue Beschreibung von diesem Wollekörbchen. Meine These wäre, dass wiederum jetzt die Beschreibung abgebrochen und ersetzt wird, müssen wir interpretieren als eine Lenkung des Blicks auf einen nützlichen Gegenstand. Und eventuell, da bin ich mir nicht ganz sicher, vielleicht auch auf den echten Reichtum des Palastes, Helena. Ja? Das wäre also mein Vorschlag, wie wir strukturalistisch diesen Topos der Palastbeschreibung deuten sollten. Ich komme zum Schluss. Ich hoffe, Sie mit der Auswahl dieser 3 Beispiele überzeugt zu haben, sich den Beschreibungen in der antiken Literatur als einem interessanten Gegenstand zuzuwenden. Ferner Ekphrasis funktional zu definieren und nicht über einen Kunst- oder Repräsentationsbegriff. Ich habe dazu geschrieben, ja, Kalypsos Grotte würde überhaupt gar nicht zum Topos passen, wenn wir mit den modernen Definitionen arbeiten würden, weil wir dort in der Natur sind und das dann ausfällt. Drittens, die Frage nach der Emotion zu stellen, die sich mit der jeweiligen Beschreibung, die mit der Beschreibung erzeugt werden soll. Wir müssen danach fragen, was in der Moderne auch nicht gemacht wird, in der modernen Debatte. Viertens, durch den Vergleich der topischen Beschreibung eine Interpretationsebene zu erzeugen, die die ausgewählten Sujets und ihre kulturelle Bedeutung in eine Relation bringt. Ich danke sehr für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. It was so interesting. And you know, dear colleagues, it's already a break according to the program. But if there are some urgent questions, 1 or 2, then please. Martin?
Well, 7 or 8 items, but 1.
Thanks.
You said no art of what we imagine. And I like the opposition between Stephan Meyer and Finale.
Oh, that's good.
Stephan Meyer has nothing to do with clavicals. But still, in the Scholia, the first text you read is recognized as a ring composition. Yeah. And they read it and they are astonished. Why can a man like Ulysses take pleasure in such not very Hellenistic forms? And I think there are mostly metric signs to say, look at this. This is a description. This is not only art or not only a very beautiful palace, but a palace in words.
Yes. Thank you for putting it like that, because that was my whole point. Yeah? We are so adapted to modern times, that we don't recognize that, of course, what we love most is just to cling to the text and to cling to words and imagine what is said in the words. And with the Palace of Alkinos, I wanted to show that maybe with those modern definitions of ekphrasis, you still can do something. Yeah, my colleagues from Lund University, from the Department of Media Sciences, yeah, they could still listen to me when I would present such an ekphrasis, because then they somehow would have the feeling of this is artful. Yeah, we talk about art or architecture and Gegenstände. Yeah, we have no events. Yeah, that is dramatically wrong. Yeah, so that is why I have underlined we don't fit to this debate about the relation between image and text. Yeah, and I would try to convince you, please stick to our good rhetoricians and the definitions as you have done. I was so pleased with your paper. And please, we have really theories that connect imagination and emotion. And I think we can help to modern theories and not vice versa.
Thank you. It's crucial, yeah. So, thank you all, dear speakers, and now we have 10 minutes, I guess, for the coffee break. Liva?
Yes, there are a few things I have to say.